It's the middle of the night, the streets are empty, and you think you're alone. But then, out of nowhere, you see a man in the distance, moving strangely, with a smile that's too wide, too unnatural. He's watching you, and then he starts walking toward you. People call him the Smiling Man, and those who encounter him never forget the fear that follows. He's not a ghost, not a shadow in the dark. He's human, or at least he looks like one. But the way he moves, the way he smiles, it's all wrong. The stories about him are always the same. He appears late at night when the streets are deserted, with a grin that stretches just a little too far. Probably because he has subscribed and loves watching spooky videos every week. Some say he dances, swaying to a rhythm only he can hear, and if you try to run, he follows. One of the most chilling stories comes from a man named James, who thought he'd have a quiet walk home until he met the Smiling Man. James was walking home from a late shift, the city's lights flickering above the empty sidewalks. He liked the quiet. It was peaceful, almost calming, to walk those empty streets where he could hear nothing but the sound of his own footsteps. But that night, something changed. As he rounded a corner onto a dark, quiet street, he saw him. A man standing under a street lamp, facing away, his back slightly hunched. He wore an old, worn-out suit, his clothes barely fitting his lanky frame. At first, James thought it was just some drunk, maybe someone who had lost his way. But then the man turned around and James felt his stomach drop. The man's smile was too wide, stretching from ear to ear, his lips pulled back unnaturally, showing every tooth in his mouth. But it wasn't just the smile. His eyes were open wide, too wide, like he was surprised by something that no one else could see. James froze. The man just stood there, under the flickering streetlight, grinning, and then he began to move, not walking, but swaying side to side like he was dancing to a slow, eerie song. His movements were jerky, almost as if his limbs were too loose, bending in directions they shouldn't. James tried to ignore him, brushing it off as some strange encounter. He kept walking, quickening his pace, hoping the man would just stay put. But when he looked back, the Smiling Man was following him, mimicking his steps. First slow, then faster, all while keeping that awful grin plastered on his face. James felt his heart race. He turned another corner, hoping to lose him. But when he glanced back, the Smiling Man was still there, closer now. And this time, he wasn't walking. He was running, his arms flailing like a puppet on strings, but his smile never changed. Panic surged through James. He sprinted down the street, glancing over his shoulder as he ran. The Smiling Man kept pace, his body moving in that unnatural, jerky rhythm, like he wasn't quite in control of it. James turned one more corner and finally stopped, hiding behind a parked car, trying to catch his breath. He peeked around the edge, hoping the man had given up. But instead, he saw the Smiling Man standing at the end of the street, facing the other direction, as if he'd lost interest. James felt a moment of relief, but then the man's head snapped back toward him, twisting at an angle that no human neck should. The smile was still there, wider than before. And then the man started dancing again, slowly swaying from side to side, as if he had found his rhythm once more. But this time, he was looking straight at James. James didn't wait. He ran, not stopping until he reached his apartment and slammed the door behind him. He checked the locks, his hands shaking, and peered out the window. The street below was empty. No sign of the man, no trace of those unnatural movements. But even now, when he walks home at night, he swears he can feel eyes on him. And sometimes, when he least expects it, he catches a glimpse of a shadowy figure swaying under the streetlights, its head tilted, and a smile just visible in the dark. The story of the Smiling Man first gained attention when it was posted on an online forum by a user recounting their own terrifying experience. It's become one of the most popular modern-day urban legends, spreading across the internet as more people shared similar encounters. Many believe he's an ominous figure that appears when you're alone at night, especially on quiet streets. But here's where things get even creepier. People from different parts of the world have claimed to see the Smiling Man in similar circumstances. His appearance, his unnatural movements, and that disturbing, too wide smile all match, as if he's not just an urban myth, but something much more real. And then there's this story, a story that takes the fear of the smiling man to an entirely new level. It was late, just past 3 a.m., when Danielle was driving home after visiting a friend. She was tired, barely paying attention to the dark, empty roads stretching out in front of her. The only sound was the hum of her car's engine, the occasional flicker of streetlights casting shadows across the pavement. But then she noticed something, a figure walking down the side of the road. At first, she thought it was just a hitchhiker, someone who'd lost their way. But as she got closer, something didn't feel right. The person wasn't walking normally. They were shuffling, their feet dragging across the pavement in a slow, awkward rhythm. And then she saw it. The figure turned slightly toward her as her car's headlights caught them. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing an old worn suit. But it wasn't his clothes that unsettled her. It was his face. His mouth was stretched into a wide smile, far too wide, like it had been forced into place. His eyes were empty, staring straight ahead, unblinking. And as Danielle passed him, his head turned to follow the car. Her heart pounded. She pressed down on the gas, driving faster, trying to shake the image of that face. But then, about a mile down the road, she saw him again. The same man, standing in the middle of the road, smiling, his arms hanging loosely at his sides. Danielle slammed on the brakes, her tires screeching as she came to a halt just feet away from him. She couldn't believe it. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of her. She locked the doors, her hands shaking as she stared at the man through the windshield. He didn't move. He just stood there, smiling. And then slowly, he began to walk toward the car. Danielle's instincts kicked in. She shifted into reverse, speeding backward down the road, trying to get away. But the man didn't stop. He kept coming, his body moving unnaturally, his limbs almost flailing as he danced toward her. When she was far enough away, she spun the car around and took off down a side street, her heart racing in her chest. She didn't look back until she reached the main road. But even then, she felt like she wasn't alone. When she got home, she couldn't sleep. The image of that smiling man was burned into her mind. And when she told her friend about it the next day, they didn't laugh it off like she expected. Instead, they looked at her, pale-faced, and said, "You saw him too?" That's when she learned about the legend of the smiling man and how he's been spotted by others in her town before. The stories are always the same. A man in a suit with a grin that's too wide, moving in ways that aren't quite human, appearing late at night when you're all alone. And once you see him, he has a habit of showing up again, even when you think you've escaped. Danielle never saw the smiling man again after that night, but every time she drives down that dark road, she wonders, what would have happened if she hadn't driven away? So what would you do if you saw him? Would you keep driving, or would you stop? Whatever you do, remember, that smile isn't as harmless as it looks. If you have any other terrifying stories, feel free to tell us in the comments below, and your story might get featured in our next video. Subscribe for more, because I post every week.